Good morning, everybody. The latest from Ukraine is that the Ukrainian counteroffensive that never happened has almost totally collapsed. In fact, there has been more of a Russian advance over the last couple of days because the Ukrainian forces are completely decimated. It's very sad because what they're doing at the moment is that they've run out of their regular army and they're press ganging ordinary young men who don't want anything to do with war and fighting to go to the front lines to be killed in their so-called counter-offensive that isn't. But in the area of Svatova, which is north of Bakhmut, Artemovsk, that was captured recently, the Russian forces have broken through the entrenched Ukrainian defense lines, the trenches that the both sides have built, very, very, fortified defenses that both sides have around the front line. Now, the Ukrainian lines have been broken and the Russian forces have stormed through and advanced about 5 kilometers up to the river that's nearby. This is all sort of in the area of Liman and Kupiansk and so on in the north, if you're familiar with the geography of Ukraine, which we've all become over the last year and a half. So this is an absolute disaster for the Zelensky regime and the Ukrainian armed forces. And now they're all turning on each other. And Zelensky's turning on NATO, and NATO are sort of turning on each other because, of course, everything the Zelensky regime does is backed by NATO. He is now saying that the counteroffensive has collapsed because he didn't get enough weapons from the West, whereas the West has been sending, the collective West and NATO countries have been sending tens of billions of pounds of weapons to fight this conflict, which didn't need to be fought in the first place. Most of those weapons have either been stolen or destroyed. They've got all of these tanks from various countries, Leopard tanks, Challenger tanks, and so on. Most of them have been blown up in the fields because they get stuck in the mud. They've got these Storm Shadow missiles from Britain now, which is terrible. My country, under the appalling leadership of Rishi Sunak, should never have given these things to escalate the conflict in Ukraine. But they're not really effective on the front lines because you've got a war of attrition going on, very much like the style of the First World War here 100 years ago. And this kind of war of attrition, people digging in the trenches, is happening again all across Ukraine. So the so-called counteroffensive, which was going to happen first of all last summer, and then this spring, and then this summer in the south, in the Zaporozhye region, where they were sort of talking up, they're going to burst through the Russian lines and they're going to charge all the way down to the Sea of Azov again, Crimea, recapture Crimea, which is now fully integrated into the Russian Federation, by the way. That just didn't happen. They advanced a couple of kilometers and then the Russians created a fire trap, slaughtered the poor Ukrainian soldiers which were forced into it by the Zelensky regime, and then pushed back again. And that's been happening over and over again in the south. And the Ukrainians have lost tens of thousands of men completely unnecessarily for absolutely nothing. But then in other parts of the country, so particularly in the east here, in the northeast, the lines have been getting thinner and thinner and thinner, and the Russians have pushed through. And they don't really know what to do. There are no men left to plug the gaps. So the Russian army has now got an open field to advance as far as they like. Now, they're probably not going to advance very far initially at the moment because they are very, very cautious in how they advance and so on. And what they've been doing for the last year or more is just creating fire traps, creating cauldrons, and then decimating the men who get the Ukrainians who get forced to go into those things. And that's why they haven't been winning in terms of territory, but that's not important. They've been winning in terms of manpower, and they have been demilitarizing Ukraine, which is the objective of the special military operation at the start, as Putin said in February 2022. Another thing that's been happening is that it's now become very, very clear that NATO countries have been sending in mercenaries by the thousand into Ukraine. So these are not officially regular army soldiers, but they've left the army and they've been reclassified as mercenaries working for private military companies, and they have been very, very active in Ukraine, and Russia has just wiped out 5,000 of them in a military base there in western Ukraine. So it's becoming very, very clear that mercenaries from Britain, from Germany, from Poland, Slovakia, all over the place, have been active in Ukraine, where NATO countries have said, oh, we're not going to send soldiers there, but they've been doing it, with this deception. But it's very obvious to see through it. But Zelensky has been blaming the West, going back to my earlier point, and saying, well, the reason the counter-offensive has failed, it's your fault, NATO, because you didn't give us enough weapons. And the other thing is, he's saying, and you didn't give us enough training to the Ukrainian army to use the weapons that you've sent us, which is utterly ridiculous. Everyone should have known that this was not going to happen, because some of the weapons systems you've got that the NATO countries are given to Ukraine needs months, if not years, of training with specialist operators. So you can't sort of just give a HIMARS system to a normal soldier and expect him to be able to use it just like that. That needs months of training. So the only people that could operate it initially would have been NATO countries' soldiers, which is why essentially they've been reclassified and gone in as mercenaries. You can put two and two together and sort of work out that some of these systems are being operated by Western mercenaries who were regular soldiers. But Zelensky is still complaining that the Ukrainians have not had enough training to operate and to fight this counter-offensive and to use the weapon systems that he's been given. So, they had a bit of a falling out a couple of weeks ago at the NATO summit, where he mouthed off and said that he hadn't been getting enough support for joining NATO as a member. Now he's mouthing off against NATO, saying, for all the weapons that they've given him, which we shouldn't have done, by the way. I'm not saying that we should have. I've been very clear on this from the beginning. We should have de-escalated, not had a conflict in the first place, and not been sending billions and billions of pounds and dollars and euros of weapons to Ukraine. But even though Western countries have been doing that, Zelensky has now turned around like an ungrateful little man, being polite there, and said, you haven't sent us enough weapons and you haven't given us the training to use them. And it's clear now that this is all going horribly wrong. Even the Wall Street Journal, which is totally establishment, has been the biggest hawk on escalating war and conflict and all this kind of stuff, and continuing to poke the bear more and more and harder, has put out a couple of articles recently which have been totally different in tone to everything that is put out over the last 16 months. And I think that this indicates that even the crazies in the Biden regime understand that this is not going to plan. So here are two headlines from the Wall Street Journal. It's behind a paywall, so I can't read them. But a couple of days ago, it put out an article saying Ukraine's lack of weaponry and training risks stalemate in fight with Russia. Now, they're actually admitting there that the NATO-backed Zelensky regime is failing in its counteroffensive, and it's not going to win. They're saying now, well, all the talk of like we're going to push back to Crimea, we're going to make regime change in Russia, and all this kind of stuff. We're going to crash the Russian economy and collectively punish the Russians for supporting this. All of that talk has now gone out of the window in the most establishment of media outlets in the US. And another one here, Ukraine's stalled offensive puts Biden in uneasy political position. So they're actually now suggesting that because the Ukraine operation has just gone completely, like it's gone wrong, and according to what NATO wanted, it's just not happened. They're now questioning Biden's leadership of this, because what was obviously the Biden family, including Hunter Biden, are getting loads of kickbacks from Ukraine. We know Hunter Biden had a £1 million a year unpaid board position with Burisma, the oil company in Ukraine. We know that there's loads of money laundering going on concerning Ukraine and various politicians in the United States, not to mention human trafficking and all the other horrors that are coming to light there. But now even the mainstream media in the US is calling into question Biden's leadership, which has been unheard of before now. So let's hope that this terrible situation in Ukraine will come to an end very soon, that the fighting will stop and the Zelensky regime will be forced to stop press ganging innocent Ukrainian men to go to the front lines and be slaughtered in their tens and hundreds of thousands. That is the biggest tragedy of this whole situation. NATO leaders do not give a flying monkey about the Ukrainian people. They all bang on about, it's for freedom and democracy. It's nothing of the sort. It is to expand their empire, if you like, into Ukraine. They want to bring Ukraine into the EU and NATO and subject it to the tyranny of the World Economic Forum and the US military-industrial complex. Two things which we could all do with being free of, both in the West and in the world as a whole. I supported NATO in the 80s and 90s in the Cold War, but now it's gone rogue. It's not about peace anymore. It's about power and money for an evil class that has taken over in the collective West, which is not acting for the benefit of the people in the collective West. We always need to make that distinction between the people who just want to get on with their lives and bring up their families and go about their business, and I'm not going to call them elite, because that is that's too much of a positive word for those people who have taken over and are now have a modicum of power and seem to be in the positions of power in the West. Those people do not care about ordinary people, either in the West or in Russia or China or Ukraine. And they all need to be gone. And I hope that this terrible scenario, if anything good comes out of this, conflict, which is not good. I'm not saying it is at all. It should never have happened, and there should never have been the suffering and carnage and death that we've seen over the last year and a half. But if anything good can come out of it, then hopefully some of these people who have been pushing war and pushing almost to get us into a nuclear conflagration, that's what some of them want. They're absolutely insane and crazy. Let's hope that some of those people get toppled and never come back again.